Nikhil, Elvis, welcome to Talk Python, me guys.
Hey, it's great to be here.
Yeah, it's awesome to have you here. You're building some cool products, and Nikhil, you're back on the show. We spoke to you back in Salt Lake City at Startup Row, and now your startup is more started, and I'm really excited to hear about it. And that's what we're mostly going to focus on this episode, talking about building Python web apps. Normally when you say something like that, a person who is not a web developer would go, "Oh, you're building apps with Python, web apps with Python. That's cool." Mm-hmm. A web developer would be like, "Okay, what is that? That's Python, CSS, HTML, JavaScript, React, etc., SQL." There's a lot going on normally, but we can winnow it down a little bit and have a little more focus. When we say Python web apps, it's a little more like that, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I think a lot of people, when they hear Python web apps, they think of, Django, Flask. Like they call themselves Python web frameworks, and they're really great frameworks. But like you mentioned, there's a lot of things that go into web development. There's front-end, back-end, hosting, etc. And when you think of frameworks like Django, Flask, they do a great job of handling the back-end, the database, the kind of connection layer. But like you mentioned, when you have to write the front end, you end up having to kind of go back to HTML, React, JavaScript, and the traditional tools. And generally in web development, you'll set up your backend as kind of one service, your front end as one service, hook them up through some sort of API, and develop through that. And it works great, but one part, like you mentioned, is there's a lack of unification. So when it comes to building an app, you have to piece together a front end, a back end, then figure out how to host it. So a really big part of why we started Reflex was to kind of simplify all these different layers of web development into one batteries included framework. And one of the biggest challenges along with the batteries included is having everything built in, but also keeping it flexible enough, right? Because people want to do all sorts of stuff with their web apps. So that's really one of the main challenges that we faced going through all this was how can we make a framework that, people can just get started, but it doesn't box them in. They can still make all the stuff they were going to make, using their JavaScript apps.
Right. That is the big challenge. And we're going to dive into that. You guys got some awesome stuff. But before we do, maybe, it's been 2 years or so since you've been on the show. Give a quick introduction, just who you are, how you got
definitely
here.
So, I'm Nikhil. I'm co-founder here at Reflex. Last time we chatted was about 1.5 years ago. At that time, our company name was Pinecone with a Y. That was at Startup Row. And our mission when we started, and even now, is to just simplify the whole process of web development from front-end, back-end, hosting, all these parts, and make a framework that simplifies all these parts so a newcomer can easily share their ideas without getting all caught up in the learning new tools, learning new languages, boilerplate and all this. Yeah. So that's been our goal from the start. And maybe just some background on why we even came to this idea. So prior to working on this, I was working at a self-driving car startup, and then I was working at Apple. And at both these roles, I was working on AI teams with really talented engineers, but we were all Python engineers. So we could do anything with database, backend, all this stuff. But when it came to something as simple as make a UI for this app, make a dashboard to showcase this data, make a little form to submit it. There's sometimes these senior engineers would be like, okay, that's not my domain. I can't do that in Python. Someone else.
Sure, I have a PhD in machine learning, but I can't build a website. So now what?
Exactly, and that's kind of where we are. And a big reason of that is, if you think about different languages and their use cases, Python is used in so many. It's one of the most broad languages. If you think about all the areas it's used, backend databases, AI, ML, all these areas. But there's really one place that it's not used traditionally, and that's kind of front end development. And for there, JavaScript is king. And if you take the inverse of that and think about JavaScript, it's one of the most popular languages in the world, right? It's 1, 2, or 3 up there. And if you think about the use case for it, it's mostly all around web applications. So what we kind of notice is, people love Python. They want to do all their work in Python when it's accessible. And people love web development, and they use JavaScript because they love web development. But there's not much usage of JavaScript outside that domain. So really our big focus was, well, can we fill in this gap in the Python ecosystem where people are doing everything in Python, and then suddenly this one domain of websites, front ends, that can't be handled, and they need to use a different tool, use a different language, outsource that. And that was a big thing we wanted to solve. The same people with the ideas, building the backend, building the AI, building the whatever it is, should be also the people presenting it, building the UI layer, and kind of sharing their ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. Many people I talk to would rather build everything in Python, but they end up piecing it together as they have to. Elvis,
Yeah.
good to see you.
Yeah, same.
Yeah. Quick introduction about you.
Yeah, so I guess we met at PyBay.
Yeah, we did.
Yeah, so that was very, very fun. And yeah, so I'm Elvis, he, him, his. I'm working at Reflex as a developer advocate. And prior to this, I was working at Warp. So I was there like 3 years doing like developer experience, developer relations.
Yeah. Shout out to Warp.dev, man. That is an awesome terminal. I really enjoy that. I use that pretty much universally now. And yeah, thank you for that recommendation. It's still going strong.
Yeah, very good team. Really good
Yeah.
product.
Yeah. Yeah, awesome. So now you're working at Reflex, formerly Pinecone, same company, new name.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, even doing more, this Warp is more Rust, right? So now you're more in the Python side of things, yeah?
Yeah, but even there, I was like, everything that I was building was like internal tooling to like optimize developer experience. And so everything was in Python. And so that's how I actually came across Reflex. And then I was like, oh, this is a dream, like being able to like work in open source and build Python apps and like serve the community. And so when I saw that job posting, I was like, whoa, I would love to join. And they were in SF, so that was great. So I could just walk over to the office and things. So
Yeah, that is kind of the magic of San Francisco, right? Like, it's not you and potentially a whole family move thousands of miles away. It's just you take a different bus or a different BART train or something.
yeah.
Yeah, very cool. All right, well, Nikhil, let's talk really quickly just about Startup Lane. Like we had, I was just looking back on this as I knew you were coming on the show, and I was like, well, what happened to all those companies? And I don't have a totally good sense. I know that some of these have pivoted. We had Ponder, we have Generally Intelligent, we had Werobots, Neptine, Nixtla, Pretty Base, and Pinecone, which is now Reflex. And this was, what is this Startup Row really quick while we're on this topic?
Yeah, so
how'd you get on there?
Yeah, so this was back when we first started. I think our company was maybe 1 or 2 months old, and we were part of the Y Combinator Winter 23 batch. So while going through that, we launched on, I think, Hacker News early January, and that's when we first started, publicizing our open source, getting users on it. And we got quite good traction when we started. And part of one of the events that was happening was PyCon, which was, I believe, in April of that year. And it was a great opportunity for us as a Python company, to kind of meet our audience. And so part of that was the Startup Row, where there was a lot of, I think seed or very early stage startups coming to present. So at that time, we were maybe only 2 months old, so very, very early, but it was still a really great experience. I think it was probably the first event, that we've done as a company. So that it was a really good experience to meet different Python developers and to meet all the other developers that, the companies you mentioned, even ones that were not that aren't listed here. There's a bunch of awesome Python people that came there. So
yeah, it's not just the companies that are in Startup Row. That's its own special thing. But the whole expo floor hall is a pretty awesome place to just walk and mingle and learn what people are up to.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, that's cool. I know that Ponder got acquired, so congrats to them.
Oh, nice.
They got acquired by Snowflake.
Nice.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. Generally Intelligent. Their founders are some of our friends. They're an investor in our company. They rebranded now to Imbue.
Okay.
So I think
they're
doing well as well.
Yeah, I think whoever put together that group, whoever selected the companies that go there, did pretty good because startups don't have typically a huge likelihood of succeeding, but I think most of these are still around. So that's awesome.
Yep.
Yeah, cool. All right. Well, let's talk. I mean, we've introduced it a little bit, but Reflex. Let me just read. I'll read the H1, the H2 for you, and then we'll go from there. How's that? Front-end, back-end, pure Python, and then the open source framework to build and deploy web apps, no JavaScript required. there's a lot to unpack there. So, tell people what Reflex is, and then we'll dig into the use cases and some of the open source stuff and so on.
Yeah, so like we kind of talked about earlier, Reflex is a Python framework to build web apps in Python, and it's an open source framework, so you don't have to sign up for a SaaS or do anything. You just do pip install Reflex, kind of like what's shown at the bottom, and you can start using it like any other Python library. And like I mentioned, the key distinction that we're trying to do is kind of unify the whole web stack. So all the parts that normally go into web development, building a front end, building a back end, connecting them, maybe including a database, and then deploying it. Usually these involve using several different tools, technologies, even often multiple languages. And the overhead for that could be really high. So if you think about before, like a full-fledged web app, usually you're not going to do that unless you have, you have like a mission to do. Like you have something you're trying to make, you have it kind of spec'd out, and you're going to kind of invest that effort into it. It's very hard, or most people aren't going to, prototype a web app or kind of build out like that because the overhead needed is way too high to kind of mess around with. So what generally happens, especially for Python developers, is they'll use Python scripts, they'll use Jupyter notebooks, and in the Python community also, there's other pretty good frameworks, things like Streamlit, Gradio, which are also in the Python environment, and I think try to target a very similar problem that we're doing, where people have their data, people know Python, and they want to showcase it. So these are kind of the existing tools that were there before we started, and I think they all have their place to get started with, but they're very limiting in what you can build with them, right? Like it's good for the most basic prototype. You can have a script, you can have a Jupyter notebook, but this is not something necessarily you'd want to share within your team to build out to a larger app. Like usually once it becomes a bit more complex, you
hand off to another team.
You hand it off to another team, or if you're brave, you go learn JavaScript or something. But usually there's a point where it's like, all right, I've done my job. Like someone else, like go make this production ready. And a big part of what we're trying to do different at Reflex is compared to other Python, and I'd even say other like non-JavaScript frameworks, is to keep everything in Python in one language, but without having any of these trade-offs that usually come with a low-code or no-code platform. So usually low-code and no-code, they exchange things like performance, features, things like that for usability. Customization. So you can build a certain subset of apps, but you need to kind of keep your aspirations confined to what that framework's going to give you. Like you want some random component, you want a mapping component, you have to hope that framework has it. You want to integrate with a certain database, you have to hope that they're going to give you that integration. So one of the very nice things about Python is, for especially the backend integrations, right? Like, actually, before that, let me just back up 1 second. So compared to a lot of these low code, our goal was to have the same framework you use. You can easily build to prototype your app, in a few hours, build a quick prototype of your app. And you can use that same framework to then grow your app all the way to a production grade app. So if you look at our main website, Reflex.dev, this entire website was built in Reflex. So you can kind of see that badge at the bottom. And I think this is kind of a distinguishing thing from others. Like usually to build a website like this, you would need to use JavaScript, but this was entirely built in Python and Reflex. And it just goes to show like the kind of, along what we're chatting about of you can build, a basic chat app, a little prototype app, as kind of is shown in the demo section right below on the landing page, where we have a bunch of, different use cases. So you can build that prototype, but you can also extend that all the way to a production app that's, serving either internal users or even in our case, for some startups that are serving external public users using Reflex.
Yeah, a lot of times when I talk to people about these kind of apps, often it's like we got an internal app and there's 20 people using it, and it doesn't really matter if it takes a little while for the app to load up, and we're not worried about SEO or any of those things, right?
Yeah.
But to make your product landing page, and that's a pretty big deal.
Yeah, and I'm not saying that's the typical or intended use case. Like,
sure, of course.
There's other things if you just want a static landing page, but it was more to show the extent to which it could be used. But like you mentioned, there's kind of like two domains of people that want to use us. The main audience is really developers, engineers that are not web devs, are not JavaScript devs. So obviously that includes, hardcore Python people who are, senior Python developers. But it's also just like anyone who knows a bit of coding, because Python tends to be, if people have taken one CS class, it tends to be a Python class. They've learned a bit of Python. So we actually see use cases outside of even software engineering. So people in finance, manufacturing, biology, where they before had an Excel spreadsheet, but they knew a little Python, and they're now able to develop these internal apps for their companies. So that's kind of the developer profile we're looking at. And in terms of the companies and use cases, it's a lot of small teams that they want to do more with the team they have. Like for on one hand, it's kind of startups. You have a 1-2 person startup, and you need to get your app demoed. You're building some AI thing, and you want to get it demoed. You don't want to go hire a contractor or a front end developer to build that. You want to iterate quickly and kind of work through that, especially during that iteration phase, right? Like when you want to iterate, you don't even know fully what you want to build. So it's really empowering or what we're trying to do is empower people by giving them a tool where they can iterate on their ideas and not have to depend on someone else.
Yeah, I think one of the problems with the low code, no code stuff for people in our orbit is they know code. They're good developers.
Yeah.
They just might not be front end developers or designers or whatever. So I think it's probably a little frustrating to work with like really low code, no code type of stuff, because you're like, if I could just program, there's just a little bit of code would totally make this work. Yeah. But it's in JavaScript or it's in something else. Like Elvis, when you're talking to people about this, like how do you present this versus something like Retool or Gradio or something like that?
It's funny because I was using Retool at the last company, and one of my frustrations was
and they've been a sponsor of the show. I think they do make pretty cool stuff, but it's different, right?
Yeah, it is different. I think Retool is very powerful. They have a lot of plug and play. I think for someone if you're coming from a developer background, I think you're so used to having full control that like giving some of that control away can be a difficult adjustment. And I think one of the nice things about Reflex is that all of these UI components get transpiled into React, right? And so one of the key value props is that you're bringing an entire ecosystem closer to backend people. And so there's a couple companies that will have someone doing front end and making components just for their internal tools team. And it's like you can just wrap those in Reflex, and now all of your components still adhere to like your style guide or to your theme. And so you're not really like limiting people in terms of like the components that they have available to them, because it is React under the hood.
Oh, that's pretty interesting.
It's like very elegant because it turns into FastAPI and React. So it's like you're not really limited when it comes to like producing apps that can get bigger or like scale or like have like routes and things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, that's cool. So it's basically some developer tooling on top of React. And then what you end up programming is probably mostly generates React. And then it's also FastAPI in the back end. That's really neat.
Yeah, so basically going back to, as we were developing this, the most important thing we kept in mind was, okay, we want to make it really easy. A newcomer should be able to build this, but not have, pretty much have ways to do anything, right? Like never make people hit that graduation point where they're like, okay, I've hit the limits of Reflex. Let's go use a serious framework like React. So it's very intentional that people never hit that goal. And like one way that we achieve that is you code everything in Python, but the end output that it compiles to is a production grade web app. So for the front end, though you're coding it in Python, the front end will compile out to a NextJS app. The back end will compile out to a FastAPI backend that hook up together. So it's pretty much the same architecture you would write as if you were writing it by hand. So we're not taking a shortcut as in like, if you were to write it by hand, it would actually compile. You would probably write a Next.js front end, FastAPI backend, and connect it. And we're kind of giving a layer on top of that. And by developing on top of React, it goes back to this, we don't want to reinvent the wheel. Web dev is a really mature ecosystem. We're not going to be able to, remake React and all the components out there. So when we started, our big approach was let's wrap React. And not only do our components wrap React, but we make it very easy for developers to wrap their own components. So kind of like what Elvis said, we have companies like Fortune 100 companies that internally they have their own React component library that they must use for every app that they're building. And they were able to wrap those in Reflex, and now they can use their private custom React components. One person wrapped it once, and now any Python developer is able to access it and develop with it. So our really big point is like, you're not going to be locked in. We have 60 plus components built in, But anything that's possible in React and JavaScript, you can easily bring that to Reflex without waiting for us.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a bit of an escape hatch to just go down straight to React.
Well, yes, but the nice part is you don't have to write the React directly. I mean, you can write it once, but after that, we have a third-party component ecosystem. So I can show you on our website later as well, but many people have published their own third-party components. So,
Oh, interesting.
for example, like we don't have a map component built in. So last week, someone published a Reflex map component. So if you want to like hook up a map into your thing, it's now possible. And there's a lot of these.
Grid.
Yeah, AG grid, audio recording, and all these like niche cases, right, where we're not going to be able to support it all. But the nice part about having an open source and open source community is community can add to the project, share it with others, and everyone can benefit from it.
Cool. So another one of the challenges of the low code, no code type stuff has to do with the deployment side of things. I maybe buy a SaaS subscription at some low code place, but in practice the performance is just not good enough to, if you put it on the internet, it'll just not take it or something like that, right? But if it's basically JavaScript over FastAPI, like that's a very well known and super scalable setup, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so part of that is in the unification, it wasn't only front end, back end, it was also deployment, which a lot of people, they build their app and deployment takes as long, if not longer, than the actual building.
And the DevOps all along the way, yeah.
Yeah, especially if you've never done this, right? Like to go learn about how to domain names and what is like
SSL,
what is S3, SSL, like all these things take a long time. And going back to the thing of balancing that thing of batteries included, yet if you don't want to use our batteries, you should be able to self-host it. So along those lines, what we've included in Reflex is a one-line deploy. So after you've built your app, you can just type Reflex deploy. We set up all the infrastructure and you'll get a URL back that anyone can access your app through. So we have the actual hosting service built in as well to Reflex. And if you don't want to use that, like many companies, say you want to deploy on your private cloud or et cetera, we're really like, it's really important to us to stay with like open source and make it so, if you want to use it in your own use case, that's always possible. So we have guides and make it easy to deploy on all these. And like you said, because it's kind of a standard output, it's kind of easy to self-host it yourself as well.
Right. What you know about running FastAPI probably translates pretty well.
Yep.
What's the database story? There's got to be a database, right?
Yep. So this goes back to like the whole batteries yet flexible. So we have a built-in ORM similar to Django. It's nothing but a kind of light wrapper around SQL Alchemy, but kind of hooked up more to Reflex. So kind of taking care of some abstractions in terms of making the models work with Reflex state, et cetera. So the nice part is we have first-class support for any SQL database because of the SQL Alchemy like tight integration. So when you start Reflex, you have a built-in SQLite database that gets, any app that wants it, it's there for you. You don't have to do any setup. So you can start developing with databases right away, like without having to learn too much outside or doing any setup. And then once you want to go to production deployment and you want to use, say, Postgres, MySQL, or whatever you want to use for your actual database, it's just a matter of, in our config, putting the database URL that you want. So we make it really easy to partner with whatever you're doing. So a lot of people use us with providers like Supabase, Neon, where they set up their database using one of these providers and they can easily connect it to their app.
Yeah, that's cool. So basically anything SQL Alchemy supports, just set the connection string and you're good to go.
Yeah, and along that line, right, like a lot of people ask us follow-up questions like, well, how do you handle MongoDB? How do you handle NoSQL? How do you handle like XYZ tool that I want to use in my app? And this is another part where I think our big advantage over low-code, no-code frameworks where, if you want, say, a drag and drop builder to support your random database, because there's no code in it, you're kind of dependent on them, right?
Yeah.
For us, we kind of have this kind of nice privilege where we can say, hey, it's just Python. Go use the Python library. Anything you can do in Python, you can like integrate it in Reflex. So we give a lot of first-class support, but a lot of what we're doing is we're on the shoulders of React and Python.
Oh, interesting. So if I wanted to use, say, Beanie and Pydantic and MongoDB,
I
just do that?
Just do pip install whatever the library is and use it like any Python. So for example, like a huge use case people use us with is, AI apps. So a lot of people use OpenAI, Anthropic, and all this. And it's just a Python library away. And oftentimes they already have written that Python script first, right? And they just
Yeah.
want a UI on top of it. So it's like even easier to hook up at that point.
Yeah, that's very cool. Elvis, anything you want to add to that before we move on? This whole deployment, managing, DevOpsy side of things.
Yeah, it reminds me of the quote where like any like sufficiently advanced technology is like indistinguishable from magic. Because like we recently sponsored CalHacks, and like being able to like see people who are taking like CS1, CS2, like the magic like in their eyes when like they can like run it and then like a website comes up, like it's just so compelling, you know. And then so like for me, I'm just like looking forward to the future where more people can use it, and then we can just like make like the web ecosystem like more democratized, you know, like just giving power to people who like don't have a JavaScript experience, you know.
Yeah, it's a big part of the Python story as well, right? You know, one of the alternatives to this is notebooks, right? Which I know it's not even close to the same thing. But a lot of people who are not web developers or just don't want to take a month to build a website, right? They'll kind of create a notebook and use the notebook to visually communicate in interesting ways, right? But when it comes down to, I want something that feels like a website for someone, it kind of falls short most of the time to use a notebook for that.
Yeah, and
but it is that has, sorry, the reason I brought it up is notebooks totally democratized visualization and interaction for data scientists in a way that was massive.
No, yeah, I completely agree. And I think most people would agree like a web interface is nicer than a notebook, but a notebook is so much easier to build, right? So when considering that trade-off, people are like, all right, here's my Jupyter notebook. Yeah. And what we're trying to do is make it as easy to, convert your notebook to a website that's more easily shareable, more easily kind of deployable, and all this other stuff. And I guess along those lines, I think we're gonna chat about it maybe a bit later, but our goal, like right now, a big part of it is making, you can write your UI in Python, right? So it's making that part of it more accessible. But our goal is not necessarily, to stop at Python. Our goal is just to make it easy for someone with an idea to build a web app. So along those lines, like as we've started, a lot of the positive comments people have said is, now I can, one language, one framework. But still, it's just because you know Python, that doesn't suddenly mean you're a designer, you're a web developer. Like I can now make, an Airbnb style website just because the HTML is now in Python. So a big part of what we're trying to do is accelerate a lot of the entire process, because fundamentally, I think people have in their mind, like they know what they want to build.
Yeah, they know what it looks like in their head.
In their mind, they can visualize it, but it's kind of their technical implementation and their tool, like all of those are not good enough for what's in their mind to become reality. So that's why they have to settle for notebooks, settle for, an approximation of what's in their mind, because they're like, this is with my time and effort and tools. This is like what I'm trying to do. Yeah. And along those lines, so I think Python is definitely one good aspect of it, because, it's now in their language. We're trying to bring it to where they are. But there's a lot of stuff that I think the whole web dev ecosystem is going to change in like the upcoming years, and we want to be part of this kind of new age of AI frameworks that's incorporating things like AI along with code, and kind of that integration between the two, where a lot of stuff that's easier to do in AI, it makes sense to do there, but it's important that the output of that is something that the developer can understand, edit, and kind of work with. So it's still their contribution that's getting built in the end.
Yeah, I'm skeptical of many integrations of AI into, I'll say, most apps. But I know you're leaning towards not play with a little bit. It's pretty neat. So yeah, we'll get to that. But yeah, it's pretty empowering, because if you just stare at a blank screen of HTML where it literally just says angle bracket HTML, angle bracket body, now what? Like that's daunting,
Deer in headlights.
I think that's kind of the point we're trying to go after, because you've probably seen, like, there's a lot of AI website generators that they'll make kind of your landing page. I think there's two real downsides to a lot of existing ones that we're trying to kind of attack differently. One is they're mostly meant for static sites, right? Like they'll give you your thing, but it's very hard to add your actual stuff to it. And part of that is they generate kind of the stuff, but it's not in a way that's usable by the end user. So you could generate a nice dashboard interface, but for a developer, they're like, well, how do I actually put my data in there? How do I hook it up with my database? How do I actually make this nice thing actually practical? So I think that's kind of the approach we're trying to do, is like, if we have these AI features, it's not just an AI to build. It's something that the developer can also, understand the output with and work with it. So it's like Python we see as great in this thing as like an intermediate language with which both AI can kind of write to and a developer can actually understand in the end, compared to an AI outputting a bunch of React code, which would be really hard for then a Python developer to actually go make modifications with.
Yeah, exactly. It's write only, and you can't do much with it after it's created. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, cool. All right. Before we talk, I want to talk you through some of the little examples and what code looks like within the constraints of a mostly audio show, to the extent that we can do that. But I want to talk open source first, so because one of the considerations when you guys said, "Hey, let's circle back and talk about Reflex," I'm like, wait, I don't know what Reflex is, but then it's Pinecone, right? I'm always a little bit hesitant to have just a company on the show because I'm afraid it's just, well, we're just going to talk about our product all day. But, I think there's one, I feel like having an option to write Python code across the board is super interesting for Python people. There's a few other things that I've covered previously that are somewhat like that. Like Anvil is close, but it has a very different approach. And Streamlit, very different approach, but kind of somewhat very slightly sort of similar output, but not the same for sure. Yeah. But also just the fact that you guys have this also as open source, I think that's a pretty compelling option. And so one of the things I think this makes it pretty relevant for people. And then I looked at the GitHub repository and it has 20,000 stars. That's like a third of Flask or a third of Django. That's pretty good, you guys.
Yeah, I mean, so when we started, we always wanted to open source it from the start. I think that was like very, very important to us. I think our idea was I'd rather have, a large number of users and only X% of them say on a paid product than a small number of users that are all paying. Like our biggest thing is all about kind of the community. And related to that, I don't think there's been many, especially in like, say, web frameworks. I can't really think of many web frameworks that are not open source that have really took off. Because a big part of things like web frameworks are the ecosystem around it, right? Like it's not just the framework, but what are all the stuff people build on top of it, like the integrations, the components, the tutorials, and all this stuff around it. So a big part of what we wanted to do was open source it, make it really easy for people to get started, and not have a huge like burden to even start, and pretty much lower all the activation energy that someone would need to get their first app up and running.
Yeah.
Yeah, and actually the open source has really been good. Like it's been awesome for our community. So when we first started, like a year and a half ago, like people, what is very surprising to me, like this is the first time I've done an open source project, led an open source project. And it's what was most surprising in a positive way was like how many people are eager to contribute to open source. Like I did not expect when I started, but like so many people were like, hey, can I work on this? Hey, can I add this feature? And what's really nice is like we have our Reflex core stuff that we're working on, but everyone has a different use case of what they're trying to build with it, right? So it's like this balance of like, okay, we have a plan of our roadmap, we're gonna add these features, but then other people will say, well, I want an audio component for this, and I want this. And the nice part about being open source is we really encourage people to add their own stuff to it. When they hit a bug, a lot of people are like, all right, it's open source. I can just go fix the bug. I don't have to rely on the maintainers. So for the and like going back to, kind of the velocity, because we started around a year and a half ago, and I think we're getting pretty good traction. And a lot of that is because of our great kind of community that's been building a lot for us.
Yeah, it is an interesting aspect of choosing what platform you want to work with, right? Because if it's closed source, it might be great, but you're stuck with whatever you're going to get, right? Maybe, fingers crossed, something comes, but no promises, right? But if it's relatively small, like a component or something, then people can add their own, and that's pretty cool.
Yeah, that's pretty much like whenever I'm like evaluating like tools to bring into our tech stack, especially for go-to-market, one of the first things I look at is like, it's like open source and then their docs. And like whether they have an API. Like those are like my first three like top tier criteria. That way we're not like constrained in the future if the company decides to pivot or to change their roadmap and things.
Right, absolutely. So pivot, it definitely could turn out bad if it's your platform, right? Yeah. So Apache 2 license, tell me what does that mean for people who want to go and build stuff with us?
Apache too. So basically, we wanted to make it as permissive as possible. So I think the gist of it is you can kind of use it for anything you want, paid, commercial, open source, whatever it is. The only restriction, as far as I understand, I'm not an expert, by the way, so maybe anyone looking into it consult the license themselves. But I think it's just you have to like attribute trademarks if you're copying the code with it. But we really wanted to make it super permissive, like let anyone use it, and then build products on top of it, like our hosting, like more premium components, like built-in auth, that will provide value for people that are using it in a business or more production use case.
Mm-hmm.
So the core
Okay.
open source, it's really important. Like anyone who wants to build anything, like we want to give them something to start building.
All right. And so it's always interesting to me. On one hand, we have a business and employees. Two, we're giving away our thing.
Mm-hmm.
That turns out to be a pretty good business model these days. But it is a little bit, like, well, how does that work? And I think what you all are offering is pretty helpful. Basically, in addition to the core product, right? The real reason which you can go and sign up at Reflex.dev is take away the trouble of hosting this, upgrading it, maintaining it, patching it. Just push a button or a CLI command and your thing lives, right?
Exactly. Yeah, we want to simplify the process of hosting because once you build your app, you end up having to host it anyways. And there's a lot of clouds out there, right? And we have self-hosting guides, so anyone that wants to can do that themselves. But a lot of these clouds, they're configured to host any type of app, right? Which is really great for the cloud because they can host anything. But for the user, it means it ends up being a lot of configuration, a lot of setup, and a lot of overhead when they just want to get their app and share it with someone. So one part of what we're doing with our hosting service is making the UX around it really nice. So just a simple deploy command, your app is up and running. The second is we're really able to optimize our hosting around Reflex apps. Since it's the only type of app that we host, we can really optimize the performance, the cost, and all these other factors, as well as add a lot of stuff on top of it. For example, in the future, like analytics and different stuff on your app, where that's another add-on if you're using a third-party hosting. So there's a lot of plugins on the open source side, but there's also, once you've hosted your apps, a lot of things you end up having to add in terms of like analytics, tracking, monitoring, etc. Yeah. And we have unification on the kind of framework level, but also we're going to have it on the cloud level where every part of the framework and from the front end back into the hosting kind of knows about each other.
Yeah. So you can probably get some big machines and have a multi-tenant database with good performance, stuff like that.
Yeah, exactly. And a big part of there's kind of two aspects to our hosting. One is a public cloud, and you can think of that similar to Vercel for Python. So that's more geared to, say, hobbyists, startups, people that want to build their ideas shared with the public community. And another big use case, which is where a lot of our app developers come from, is the internal app use case.
Sure.
And so that's kind of another aspect where we're building tools to easily deploy to your internal cloud, monitor who's accessing your apps, etc.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I saw that over on Reflex.dev. If you go to pricing, it's basically free for hobbyists, coming soon for pro.
Yeah.
You don't have anything to announce yet, do you?
Yeah, we're basically working on our pro hosting service. So right now we have a hobby, so anyone can kind of deploy a few apps for free. But our pro is going to have features like custom domains, ability to configure your machines, multi-region, and make it actually
Let's encrypt probably.
Yeah, SSL, all that. So actually making it kind of able to serve more users.
Yeah, nice. I'm pretty fascinated by the idea that it's FastAPI in the back end, because I'm always concerned that these things just don't scale. Like you're going to build it and it's awesome for 100 people, but then if it ever becomes popular, then it's a bad idea. It just doesn't take it.
That's a big reason also why we built our website, as this is kind of the leading edge, cutting edge Reflex app. Like hopefully if in terms of features and number of traffic, like it's tested our framework a lot in terms of like improvements to support it.
I'm sure that it has. All right, let's talk for a few moments maybe about what the programming model looks like. Just keep in mind, most people listening can't see what we're talking about, but nonetheless, let's just give people a sense of what it's like to write code in this, okay? So if you go to Reflex.dev and scroll down like just half a page or something, there's a little tab thing across the top here that has how do you create a form, how do you create a chatbot, How do you create an image gen? And this thing's pretty cool. It says, what do you want to see? And all this stuff is live, right? So I can come down here and type, I want to see a bunny. And within just a moment, boom, there's a bunny running on, where was it? I don't remember where I saw it. Running on Flux, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, Flux, here it is. Flux Schnell, fast, the fast version.
It's very fast.
So it's pretty fast compared to, I was playing with Midjourney yesterday, and that took a while, then a lot of 500 errors, and it took a while longer, then eventually I got a picture out of it. Yeah, it's pretty cool. You got charts and so on. Let's maybe just talk about this, little send us a message, put your name, email, and message. Like, what does it look like to code up one of these things?
Yeah, so basically in all these examples you show, the code on the right is the entire code needed. So it all fits in one file. Like, there's no extra stuff you need beyond that. So if you were to copy that and run it in an app, it would actually run. And
it's just to give people listening a sense, there's probably
like
50 lines, 45 lines, something like that of code. Yeah, okay.
And so one thing you'll notice is it's all in one language, and in this case, even one file. So it doesn't have to be in one file. Like, you can have multi-page, et cetera, Reflex apps. But the kind of nice part is the front end and back end can live together in one repository. And so normally, people that have written front end, they're probably used to either writing React HTML tags or, templating through Jinja, et cetera. And what we kind of do different in Reflex is we define your front end as nothing but Python functions. So it fits in exactly with all the Python syntax. You don't have to kind of learn a new language there. Everything is a Python function. So for example, normally when you have a button, rather than writing an HTML button tag, we have built-in components like rx.button, which as you call it, will create a button. And the kind of layout of the front end, if you've ever worked with React, it's very similar to React or even HTML in the sense that you have this nested tree structure that kind of maps directly to the HTML DOM. And within there, you can define all your UI components. So that kind of is how the front end works. And once you define your UI, these Python functions compile down to a React app in the end. Now, the interesting thing is how to make this interactive, right? Like, how do you add state to this? So in this example, you want to do a form, or in the image generation, I really want to hook this up with my OpenAI or my Midjourney model to create something. So normally in web development, you end up having to write a front end, a back end, and a networking layer between the two, where you set up a FastAPI endpoint for every single action you want. Then on the front end, you're going to call that API, get the result back, parse it back, and then update your UI. So that's the normal flow of, say, even adding one new feature. Like, if you want to add a button that generates an image and shows it, it will involve touching like multiple files, going through all these stuff, and hooking it together. So one thing that we've done in Reflex beyond bringing it to one language is abstracting away the front end, back end networking layer. So in Reflex, you'll never have to write an API call. You never have to write a post request, a get request, or any of that. All of that is done under the hood. So to set up your kind of state and interactive, you can do this all within what we call a state class. So a state class is just a normal Python class, and within it, you define all the fields in your state that can change over time, which we call vars, as well as any event handlers that can change the vars. So an event handler is just a Python like function or method. And I think the image gen is a good example of it. So for example, in the image gen, the image URL is a var because it's something that's going to change. And an event handler would be the get image function, which is a function that when they hit submit on the input, we call it. So in order to hook up the front end and back end, all you have to do is hook up the UI to the Python function. So you can say button on click equals state.getImage. And what this does under the hood is when you click that button, it creates an event. It sends it through a WebSocket to the backend. It will run your Python function on the backend. So whether that's your OpenAI, your replicate, whatever it is, all their state runs on the backend on a server, and that's what allows us to keep the state in pure Python. So it will update your state UI. In this case, it's going to update the image URL and send that back. And it works very similar to React in the sense that as your state updates, the front end updates reactively.
Yeah, that's super cool. Yeah, it kind of does two-way data binding on the values there.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
All right. So you just said something interesting, that there's the NextJS React front end, the FastAPI backend. But you didn't say it's calling HTTP APIs. You said it's using WebSockets.
Yes.
What's the deal there? Why WebSockets and not Pydantic over HTTP or something?
No, it's a really good question, and I think this is and a lot of people ask us, how is Reflex's performance, or what are the downsides of Reflex? Like, what's the catch? Because up to now we've been saying, we can perform, create anything you can do in JavaScript, anything you can do in React. So a lot of people are kind of ask about the performance, and we kind of design Reflex to be really performant in everything we do. And the reason we use WebSockets is because Reflex apps, especially like very stateful apps, often need to make a bunch of requests. So rather than having to reestablish a new HTTP request every time, by keeping a WebSocket, we are really able to optimize the speed of the apps. So when you create, when you kind of send type your prompt, say you want a bunny, and you press enter.
I changed it to a fast bunny, by the way, because you said the website was fast. Now we have a fast bunny.
So when you want that fast bunny, it will create a little event that says, hey, this guy wants to call get image, and he typed fast bunny. It'll take that little payload, send it through the WebSocket that's already been established, run the Python function on the back end, and then send only the state delta back. So for example, if you have a really large app with hundreds of pages and hundreds of states, changing this is not going to say, hey, front end, this is their entire new state. We only send the diffs and stuff back over the WebSocket. So
Yeah.
all of this was done like in the name of performance and making Reflex apps really snappy for whatever you're doing.
Oh, interesting. So in a sense, the Python code that I write, even though there's this React bit, some of it still lives on the back end.
Yeah.
And
I
then
think
some of it gets kind of mirrored to React on the front end. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think this is something, especially like as people are learning Reflex, like one of the things we try to emphasize most, which is though it's all in one file, it's all in Python, there still is a distinction between the front end and back end because of this fact that the front end compiles to NextJS app while the back end is a FastAPI. So in this case, it's pretty much all the UI code, right? Like what's inside the index function. That's your Next.js React app. Your FastAPI is pretty much your state and your event handlers. So within there, you can keep everything in pure Python, use anything you want. The one thing you can't do and we can't do is compile arbitrary Python to JavaScript. So that's the reason all the event handlers run on the server. So you can use any library, anything you want. And on the front end, we only compile kind of a static website. So there's no logic that ever happens on the front end, actually.
Yeah. Okay. Just updating the bindings and
the front end is just like a
events.
dumb UI. It's like, what? Give me the state. I'm going to show the state.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, it's definitely a nice bunny. So one thing that I think is notable here, and I've seen this in other frameworks as well. Like for example, I had PewPie on Talk Python recently, which is also sort of React stuff on the front end, but this is a lot more. PewPie is more running, I think, React type stuff almost in PyScript, I believe.
Nice.
All on there, which is interesting, right? But one of the things that I think you find with a lot of these is the shape of the code matches the DOM a lot of time, or at least the conceptual idea of the hierarchy of the UI, right? So, for example, here you've got a V stack with a skeleton with a flex, and then you start putting forms, and in the forms, and all of this, every word that I said there is another level of indentation. And then you indent, and you get a React input and a React button, and you unindent Python style, right? And I think it makes it pretty easy to think about. Here's the code, here's the UI, because the shape of the code matches the concept. It like mirrors the UI in some ways, right? And rather than just pure, top to bottom imperative, we're just generating the UI, but it actually, like the way it's structured, it like kind of like Flutter, it looks like it matches it,
Yeah, so I think there's kind of two approaches people in the space have taken to building. Like one is imperative, which is kind of what you said, and I think, for example, Streamlit has taken this approach where to do a button, you would do like st heading, st button, and it will implicitly like kind of magically put it into its thing. And I think it could be good for simple stuff, but it's really hard to reason about as your thing gets larger, because you have to kind of contextualize, wait, has this been called already? Like, what order is everything going through?
Is the button in this group or is it outside of the group?
Yeah.
Or, stuff like that, right?
Yeah, so I think it's nice in some sense, but it's I don't think it scales very well, especially like conceptually. Like, it's hard to kind of reason about what all you've kind of built. So I think I guess going back to like why it's in this structure, it's like this is already kind of the natural structure, right, from HTML, from React. And I think a lot of, as we were going through stuff related to API design, we try to improve the API where we can, but a lot of the times we realize, the people that did it originally had a good idea, and there's a reason it's kind of the standard.
Yeah, for sure. I think it takes a little getting used to be honest, to see such nested stuff, but I do like it. I think it's good.
Yeah, and I think part of it, I think in this example, we kind of nested it just to show, it's all in one function. But in a more practical setting, you would break this up into different components. So similar to React, you probably wouldn't have a giant nested thing. And you can think of each of those things as units that you work with.
Yeah. Also, like, decorators help a lot with, like, making dynamic components on the fly in terms of functionality.
Yeah. All right, let's talk about just a couple more things while we're here. I want to talk about the components. And the components are these building block pieces. Like, maybe pick just a couple you think highlight the idea of these things, and we can talk about them.
Yeah, so I guess a really big thing people use this for is kind of like tables and graphing. So maybe if you go down to the table section, the AG grid one might be a good one. So this is actually a good example of a third-party component. So you can see we have our built-in components, but a lot of our enterprise users really wanted this AG grid feature, which is one of the most popular kind of table libraries. So we make it really easy. This is an example of a third-party library someone's wrapped that you can kind of bring in. And this is an easy way to kind of showcase your data. So a lot of data scientists, et cetera, use this library. It can hook up with your data frames and kind of show this. So this is another example showcasing kind of the flexibility of, you want that random React library, even if it's not in Reflex, like the team or external contributor often wraps this easily. And yeah, the kind of nice part about it is it's more high level. It has a lot of these built-in features like pagination, searching, sorting, and all these. So, I think it's this balance, right? Like, we can give people the raw components. Like, you can code everything in HTML. You can build everything from the ground up yourself, or you can use this kind of high-level thing. And the nice part about Reflex is you can kind of approach it at any level that you want. So it's like, I want this nice built-in thing that has sorting pagination. Here it is. Or you're like, I'm just going to build everything from the ground up. I want my own table component. We also give you the tools to do that. So I think it just kind of shows the scale at which you can kind of pick your level of abstraction as you're using it.
Yeah, then you just pip install the name of the thing and then just use it like a native component, right?
Exactly, and it will act as if like all other Reflex components. So there's nothing like distinct between our components and something you would wrap yourself.
So if I was a reasonably sized company with a team of maybe many of them knowing React, it might make sense for me to build out a internal library of widgets that we use on our app and plug into Reflex, something like that.
Definitely, and to that point, like, we have a whole guide on our website on wrapping React with different examples. And we're trying to make it accessible for Python developers. So because that's our user at the end, right? So we wanted to make it accessible for even a non-JavaScript, non-React expert to be able to wrap these components. So we've seen in different companies, like I kind of mentioned earlier, that have their internal component systems in React. A Python developer was easily able to kind of wrap these because we make it super easy to wrap as just a Python class where you just define the props. So maybe if you go to the wrapping React section on the left-hand side, it's kind of at the, maybe go back to the main docs section. But yeah, we try to make it really easy to bring your own components as well. So whether you already have one or you want to make your own. So this is like a spline one, and you can see all you have to do is list all the props. It's a Python class. You kind of have to just go find what NPM library you're using, list all the props. And for interactive ones, you may have to define that, and then you can start using it right away.
Nice. So as part of your component, you define just basically the NPM thing to install or whatever, and then off it goes.
Yeah, and Reflex will it'll install the component, it will wrap it for you, and it will like compile out for you.
Yeah, very cool. All right, I said three things. One was components. The other is this AI generator, and then I want to just talk about the roadmap. So let's getting short on time here. So let's go and talk about this FlexGen thing. This is build web apps at the speed of thought, create UIs with Reflex framework with simple prompting. So maybe I want to
feel free to try one.
Podcast hosting website in the style of Talk Python to me.
Nice.
Oh, no. Here, let's build this one.
Yeah, try to refresh and run it one more time.
All right.
So this is in beta. Like we're kind of released it on our Discord, and we're going to do more releases. But this version of it is similar to if you've seen like v0.dev from Vercel. This is kind of, I'd say, like a version of v0 for Reflex, where it's a web editor. You can enter your prompt. It's going to live stream your output. At the end of it, it's going to give you the code that you can copy into your app, and you can start adding a backend to it. So I guess an important note is this is more for like your starter app, right? Like when you're first starting your project and you want to get like a good starting point. Yeah, we'll fix that.
It made such a nice one for me before. Let's see. Anyway,
but anyway, the idea of this one.
Yeah,
the idea of this one is to be kind of a web editor to get your apps kind of started building out from, and this is kind of just a version of v0 for Python. So this is level 1 of what we're building with FlexGen. But a more interesting thing that we're developing now internally and are hoping to release in the next month is a local version of this. So this has no context of your existing code base. It has no context of what you're building, right? So you could ask it to build a little component. But a big issue with v0 and other of these web developers is how do I actually integrate this into an existing app? Like it's good at building brand new stuff, but how do I like update an existing app? So on this front, we're building a local AI toolbar, which has a lot of these agentic features around Reflex, but on your local. So for example, the features we have there are you can click a button and say, when I click the button, do this, or click a text and say, change, like, put a form under this text. And the big idea there, I think this is a good first start, but I think in the long run, I see the toolbar as being this way where the AI and the developer kind of integrate together with Python as the common language. So for crazy stuff that you don't want to deal with, like make a form that works in mobile view, et cetera, the AI can handle a lot of this. But once it outputs code that you can actually go understand and read, like it's not this obfuscated JavaScript or React code. It's code that you can go edit by hand if you want. And you can easily hook up your own state and data to it, right? Which is a big other thing I think other frameworks miss, which is, here's a great dashboard, great, but it's all fake data. Like, how do I actually make it hook up with my clicks, hook up with my different data? So that's a big part of what we're trying to bring to the local environment.
Yeah, that's cool. And so this thing will generate a visual look and feel thing, and you actually go show the
fake
code.
Data here, yeah. And then it's fake.
Yeah, of course.
And then you can show the code, and then right now you can kind of copy the code, start using it in Reflex. And then with the toolbar, you'll then be able to make incremental upgrades on top of this rather than starting from scratch. And that will have like full context. And on top of that, we're aiming to build a lot of stuff on top beyond just prompting and updating. Like there's a lot of improvements that we want to build on top of that as well.
Yeah, cool. All right, well, this is pretty neat. I like it. It definitely gives you some ideas for here's some possible layouts and so on, and it gives you at least a little bit of an idea of what you might want to do and take it and run with it. So that's helpful.
Yeah, I think some ideas we have in the future for the local are, buttons that can, keep your same content, show you different variations, like auto style it, et cetera. Like a lot of stuff that people don't want to deal with, but they're like, just give me some ideas and how it could look, and turn people more into like, prompters and selectors rather than implementers.
Yeah, cool. All right, let's close it out with the roadmap. Where are we going?
Awesome. So recently we just released Reflex 0.6 last month. And right now we're going after 0.7. So a big part of 0.7 is cleaning up a lot of our core components that we have, especially for the features people use the most. So the ones we're starting off with are, like you can see here, AG grid support, which is a big thing people asked. And beyond that, just like very good support with tables, databases, and graphing to help a lot of these internal apps and data science use cases. Beyond that, like one really important thing for web frameworks that we're trying to build is auth, so built-in auth. So if anyone's ever used Django, they have a really great kind of way that you can plug any auth system in. And that's often the first thing someone wants in a practical web app, right? They're like, I have, especially a data app, they're like, I have this great app, but I don't want anyone to be able to access it. And we already have integrations with third-party auth providers, but we want to bring in just like first-party auth where you can just, at a click of a button, your website is going to have auth at this point. A lot of the other stuff here is related to a lot of performance improvements that we're going to make. So one key feature of Reflex is the development experience. So one part of that is code, but the other part is things like hot reload and how fast is it for me to actually make iterations on what I'm doing. So a lot of these other tickets are internal changes we're going to do to make it easier for pretty much improve the hot reload times. So we wanted people to improve their iteration speed a lot. A lot of time, people, like pretty much all their time should be spent looking at actions and coding and not waiting for anything. And then one final thing related to kind of how we want to simplify the approach of UI and state is we're implementing a system called CSR, which is kind of, right now, I kind of mentioned there's this difference between compile time and runtime. And there's certain things, your entire UI kind of needs to be known at compile time. So you have to compile your code, and that's what you get at runtime. And what we're introducing is this idea of dynamic components, which are dynamics generated at runtime. So this will enable really cool use cases. For example, you can have a chatbot that instead of just returning text all the time, it could return components. So it could return a graph, it could return a whole Reflex page. And these could be components that you don't know upfront and are actually generated during runtime. So it's gonna help a lot in terms of flexibility and also in terms of, you know, the ease of use in using Reflex, because since they're generated at runtime, you can now use pure Python. You don't have any limitations, and there's a lot of advantages on the developer side as well. So,
yeah, that's very cool.
So yeah, this is on the open source, and we're also, like I mentioned, releasing some of our AI features. And the biggest thing, though, is we're releasing our first version of our hosting service. So our hosting service has been in beta for some time right now. But along with all this, we're releasing our first kind of paid version of our hosting service. And yeah, getting people on apps onboarded onto there is coming up. So really excited for that.
Yeah. Well, looks good. The web app framework looks really nice, so I'm sure it'll help a lot of people.
Awesome. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, guys. One final parting thought from each of you.
You wanna go?
Yeah, I can go. I think one of the fun things that I've experienced with like working here is that like even like when I'm like writing our docs, it's like some people have never interfaced with props before. And so Reflex in a way is like a bridge to the web ecosystem. So it's been fun thinking about like what are the mental models that I can take in Python to help explain things that are in web, and it's like how can we like bring those in and then create like pathways for people.
Yeah, there's not a lot of event-driven. Yeah, there's not a lot of event-driven stuff in Python, but so much of the web is event-driven. It's callbacks and stuff. Yeah.
I guess for me, I think I'm just excited about thinking about new kind of user interfaces, both in terms of like coding APIs and, you know, actual user interfaces that people are going to be able to build upcoming. I think the current web frameworks, you know, the Djangos and Flask, they've been around for a long time, and I think they have a lot of great stuff. But there's also a lot of new stuff that I think a next generation of web frameworks could like add, you know, to accelerate a lot of work. And I'm just excited about thinking of what are those features, like how can we accelerate while keeping the good stuff that's already been, you know, discovered before. And yeah, I think there's, especially now, like a lot more people are building, a lot more people are becoming builders and sharing. So I'm excited about like empowering all those people.
Yeah.
Yeah,
There's
absolutely.
a lot of abstractions to like think through in terms of like how can we create guarantees that can enable someone to be successful in the long term, especially when it comes to building apps that can serve like hopefully millions of people and millions of traffic, but then also like being flexible enough that they can still start easily. So
yeah, that's a challenge. And, you know, there's a lot of places that are struggling with those challenges or trying to solve them. Look at AWS. Just go to the services tab of AWS, right? that place serves tons of people, but boy, is it complicated to look at the 100 or whatever services and decide what you need and how they go together, right?
Yeah.
we have system initiative now though, so that's going to be huge value add. So
I think in one word, I think we're on an effort to just like simplify this whole thing and just make it really easy for more people to build.
Yeah, it's a good mission. All right. Nikhil, Elvis, thanks for being on the show. Talk to you guys later.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Nice.